So I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you're stepping into a 19th century textile mill in Manchester.
Oh, wow. Okay. That is, yeah, that's an intense visual right off the bat.
Right. I mean, you've got this deafening, just rhythmic roar of power looms everywhere. And there's this thick, choking coal smoke pouring from the stacks outside.
Yeah, and inside, you've got those ledgers in the counting house just filled with these endless, unyielding columns of production quotas and wages.
Exactly. It's hard, it's tangible, and it's just this unrelenting reality. And you look at that environment at the sheer scale of the Industrial Revolution, and you think, well, this is it.
Right, this is the engine.
Yeah, you think this is what shapes the world.
And, I mean, from a certain perspective, it is. It's the material foundation. It's cold, empirical economics.
Totally.
That factory floor is, essentially the ultimate bottom line of human existence at that exact moment in history.
But, and this is where it gets interesting, then you look a little closer at the people inside that factory.
Right.
Like, somebody working on that brutal factory floor is humming a folk tune. Or someone else has, like, etched a small, crude drawing onto the brick wall outside the gates.
Yeah, or later that evening, someone goes back to their cramped boarding house and actually writes a poem about the smell of that very smoke.
Exactly. And suddenly that rigid, mechanical spreadsheet, the pure math of the factory, it just doesn't seem to explain everything anymore.
No, it doesn't, because you've stepped out of the strictly calculable world of pure production.
Yeah.
And you wander straight into the messy, subjective, and highly contested realm of human culture. You are entering the space of imagination, of aesthetics, of art.
And that is exactly the territory we are exploring today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks. I'm really excited for this one.
Me too. Because we are taking a fascinating detour from what you might expect when you hear the names we are dealing with today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, when you hear Marxist theory, you probably immediately think exactly what we just described, right?
Yeah, an intense, laser-focused obsession with economics.
Exactly. Factories, capital, the division of labor, just the pure material grind of history. But today, we are looking at a surprising, highly cultural corner of this framework.
We really are. We're asking a really specific question today. How do art, literature, and, human imagination actually fit into a fiercely materialist worldview?
It's a question that completely upends a lot of the stereotypes out there.
It really does. Because we are going to look at how these foundational theorists of political economy, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, actually engaged with aesthetics.
Right. Because they didn't just ignore it, did they?
Not at all. They didn't push it to the side as irrelevant. They obsessed over it, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, they were voracious readers, relentless critics, and they thought deeply about how the books we read and the art we consume are tied to the world we live in.
So to get to the bottom of this, we are looking at a vast stack of excerpts from the Marx Engels collected works.
Which is often abbreviated by scholars as the MECW, just for context.
All right, the MECW. And this material, it spans their entire lives. We are looking at early philosophical manuscripts from the 1840s, personal letters written decades later in the 1890s.
Blistering literary critiques published in obscure newspapers.
Yes, and incredibly dense, heavy economic drafts, like the famous Grundriss. It's essentially this treasure trove of cultural commentary hidden inside 50 volumes of economic and political theory.
But, before we jump into the deep end of these texts, it is crucial that we establish a clear framework for you, the listener.
Absolutely. We have to set some ground rules here.
Right, because the source material we are examining today is inherently deeply political. So we want to establish clearly and impartially that our goal here is strictly educational.
Yes, 100%.
Our mission is purely to unpack the historical and philosophical concepts contained within these texts.
We are not here to take sides. We are not here to endorse the political ideologies of the authors or, the various global movements they inspired over the last century and a half.
Exactly. Think of us simply as your expert guides.
Right. We are just here to help you understand the theoretical architecture these authors built around culture and aesthetics. We're just mapping the territory so you can understand the mechanics of their arguments.
Because knowledge is most valuable when understood in its proper context.
Exactly.
And by examining these texts objectively, by taking them apart to see how the gears work, we can extract some incredibly sharp tools for analyzing media and culture.
And as we will see, these tools are surprisingly relevant to how we consume art and media today.
They really, really are.
So let's start with a concept that I feel like I've heard a million times, like Maybe in a Sociology 101 class years ago.
Ah, yes, the foundation.
Right, there is this foundational idea in this theory, the base and the superstructure.
Yes, the classic base and superstructure.
And the general idea, at least as it was taught to me, is that the economic base, how we produce our material life, the factories, the agriculture, the tech, that determines the ideological superstructure.
Which includes things like law, politics, philosophy, and of course, art.
Right. But reading through these letters for this deep dive, especially the later ones, it seems like the authors themselves were furious at how people were interpreting this.
Oh, they were constantly frustrated by it. It was a huge source of annoyance.
Really?
Yeah, because the common misconception, which is, sadly, still taught in some poorly constructed sociology classes today, is that this relationship between the economy and art is a rigidly mechanical one-to-one translation.
Like a vending machine.
Exactly like a vending machine.
You put a specific economic coin in, and you get a specific ideological candy bar out. Like if the economy's capitalist, you automatically, mathematically get a painting that perfectly reflects capitalist exploitation.
Or this absurd idea that if the gross domestic product goes down by 2%, the quality or tone of poetry must change by exactly 2%.
Which is just crazy when you think about how humans actually create art.
It is. It turns human culture into a simple math equation. And if we look at the late letters from Friedrich Engels, specifically a series of letters he wrote around 1890.
Right, it's a very famous one to a man named Conrad Schmidt, isn't there?
Yes, in volume 49 of the collected works, Engels is actively trying to kill this vending machine interpretation.
So what does he actually say to Schmidt? Because he sounds pretty heated.
He explicitly warns that distorting their theory to mean the economic factor is the only determining factor, turns the whole idea into a, and I quote, meaningless, abstract, ridiculous piece of jargon.
Wow, he did not mince words.
Not at all. He is arguing that while the economic trend is ultimately the strongest, the oldest, and the most vital underlying current, the different spheres of the superstructure have what he calls relative autonomy.
Relative autonomy. Okay, so they have a mind of their own, but only up to a point.
Yes, exactly. They operate with a degree of independence. The economy sets the ultimate boundaries, but within those boundaries, art has its own internal laws, its own momentum, and its own history.
That makes a lot more sense than the vending machine idea.
It does. And furthermore, it is about interplay. The economy influences art, yes, but art and philosophy also react back upon the economy and society.
Wait, hold on. If art can react back on the economy, doesn't that break the rule that the base determines the superstructure?
It complicates it, definitely. Which is why Engels relies on a specific philosophical concept here. He views history as a dialectical process.
Okay, dialectical. There's a very heavy philosophy word.
It is, yeah.
Whenever I hear it, honestly, my eyes kind of glaze over. So for our purposes, trying to understand how a painting relates to a factory, what does dialectical actually mean?
In the simplest terms, a dialectical approach means looking at the world not as a collection of static, isolated objects, but as a complex web of dynamic, interacting processes.
Okay.
It means that two opposing forces are constantly wrestling with each other, influencing each other, and out of that friction, something new is created.
So it's not a one-way street where the factory just yells orders at the poet. The poet is shouting back, and the friction between them moves society forward.
Exactly. The economic base is the primary engine, but the superstructure is not just passive cargo. And to understand why art has this relative autonomy, Engels talks about what the artist or the philosopher actually brings to the table. He says that people working in these ideological fields inherit a prehistorical fund of ideas.
I remember this part of the reading. He uses a really funny word for it in translation. He calls it rubbish.
Yes, a prehistorical fund of rubbish.
It's such a great phrase.
It is a brilliant, highly unsentimental phrase. And what he means is that humanity carries forward an enormous amount of baggage from the past.
Like what kind of baggage?
He's referring to things like primitive magic, old mythologies, early religious concepts, and totally outdated false conceptions of nature.
So when a novelist sits down to write a book, they aren't just looking out their window at the local factory or looking at their bank account.
Right, no.
They are inheriting thousands of years of storytelling tropes. They are using metaphors based on ancient Greek gods or utilizing plot structures that were invented by medieval monks.
Exactly. And they are looking at the history of their own discipline, too.
Oh, like past artists.
Yeah. A painter working in 1890 is responding to the brushstrokes of Rembrandt from 200 years prior just as much as they're responding to the economic reality of the art market in 1890. The artist sees themselves as working in an independent sphere.
Okay, let me try to map this out in my head.
Yeah.
Let's try a modern analogy to see if the mechanics of this relative autonomy make sense.
I'd love to hear it.
What if we think about it like a smartphone?
Okay, a smartphone.
Yeah. So the economic base, the absolute material foundation, is the operating system.
Yeah.
The OS, iOS, Android, whatever. It manages the hardware, the memory, the processors.
Right, it's the core machinery.
Exactly. It determines the ultimate physical parameters of what the phone can do.
I follow you. So where does the superstructure fit in?
The superstructure, so the art, the culture, the legal system, those are the apps running on top of the OS.
Oh, I like this.
Now, the OS dictates the limits. You cannot run a cutting-edge, massive 3D rendering app on an ancient, weak OS from 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The base limits the superstructure.
Yeah.
But the apps themselves have their own code.
Right, they do. They are written by different developers using totally different programming languages.
Right. They have their own internal logic. An app can have its own specific bugs that have absolutely nothing to do with the OS.
Yes, exactly.
And crucially, software developers port over legacy code from older versions of the app. That legacy code is Engels' rubbish.
Oh, that's a perfect connection.
It is old code that might not even make sense for the current OS. It might even be totally inefficient, but it's still in the software, because that is just how the app was built over generations.
That is actually a very precise way to visualize it. The OS provides the hardware limits, but the app has a life of its own. It has its own history, its own legacy code, and its own internal rules. And, to take your analogy a step further, Engels points out that sometimes an economically backward country can actually have the most advanced apps in terms of philosophy or art.
Wait, how does that work? If their OS is weak, shouldn't their apps be weak?
You would think so if you believe the vending machine theory. But Engels gives the historical example of France in the 18th century compared to England, or later, Germany compared to both of them.
Okay, so what was happening in Germany?
Well, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, Germany was economically lagging far behind England. England had the booming Industrial Revolution. Germany was still largely fractured and agrarian.
Right, a much older OS.
Exactly. Yet, German philosophy, from Kant to Hegel, was unparalleled. The philosophical app was highly developed and pushing the boundaries of human thought, even though the German economic OS was still catching up.
So the legacy code of German intellectualism had a momentum of its own that outpaced the immediate economic environment.
Precisely. Because the philosophers were building on the history of philosophy. They were wrestling with concepts laid down by previous thinkers, rather than just directly reflecting the state of German agriculture.
Okay, so if I am a listener applying this to how I consume media today, this is actually a pretty heavy demand.
It is. It asks a lot of the audience.
Because it means if I want to understand culture through a historical or materialist lens, I can't just be lazy. I can't just watch a movie and say, oh, this superhero movie is just a product of late-stage capitalism, end of story.
Right, because that would be the meaningless, abstract jargon Engels warned about.
Right. I have to look at the specific historical traditions of filmmaking, the legacy code of the comic book genre, the internal laws of a three-act screenplay.
Yes, all of that.
Even as I recognize that the massive corporate studio funding the movie, the economic system, is the ultimate power source keeping the screen illuminated.
It demands rigorous critical thinking. It requires you to hold two seemingly contradictory ideas in your head at once.
Which is hard.
It is. You have to understand that art is ultimately bounded by material reality, but that art is also freely operating within its own historical tradition. That is the dialectical approach in practice.
Okay, this makes a lot of sense, but, and I was thinking about this during the reading, it actually creates a huge logical loophole.
Oh, how so?
Well, if the economic OS ultimately limits what the cultural apps can do, even with their relative autonomy, how on earth do you explain ancient history?
Ah.
Specifically, how do you explain ancient Greece? Economically speaking, they had the OS of a pocket calculator.
Right, a very basic material foundation.
Yeah, they were an agrarian, slaveholding society with incredibly basic technology compared to the 19th century. And yet they produced Homer's Iliad. They produced classical sculpture artistic apps that many people argue we still haven't beaten today.
That is brilliant that you spotted that, because that exact paradox was one of the central aesthetic problems Karl Marx wrestled with.
Really? He noticed the loophole too?
He absolutely did. And to explore it, we have to look at a sprawling, unfinished manuscript he wrote in 1857 and 1858, known as the Grundriss. You can find this material in volume 28 of the collected works.
Now, the Grundriss is essentially his rough draft for Capital, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It's where he is working out his economic ideas in real time, just pacing around his study in London.
It is incredibly dense, mostly focused on money, labor, and capital. But tucked away in the introduction to this massive economic manuscript is a profound meditation on aesthetics.
Okay.
Marx introduces a concept that scholars call the unequal development of material production and art.
The unequal development, meaning the timeline of great art doesn't match the timeline of great economic wealth.
Exactly. He explicitly states that certain monumental periods of artistic creation do not directly correspond to the highest levels of material or economic development. He writes, "Let us take, for example, the relation of Greek art and that of Shakespeare to the present time. He freely acknowledges that Greek art is still considered by many to be an unsurpassed pinnacle of aesthetic achievement. It offers a standard and an ideal that modern artists still strive for."
So he is staring at the booming industrial factories of the 1850s with all their immense productive power, and he's basically asking, why didn't the invention of the steam engine produce epics that dwarf Homer's Iliad?
Yes.
Why did the greatest poetry come from a society that didn't even have printing presses?
And his answer gets to the very core of how a materialist views human imagination. It all comes down to the concept of mythology.
Okay, mythology.
Marx argues that Greek art fundamentally presupposes Greek mythology.
Okay, let's unpack that. When he says mythology, what is his definition? Is it just like a collection of stories about Zeus and Apollo?
For Marx, mythology is much deeper than just stories. He defines mythology as an era where humans subdued and fashioned the forces of nature in their imagination and through their imagination, precisely because they could not yet do it in reality.
Oh, wow. That is a really profound way to look at it.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
It is. Because they didn't have the material technology to control the weather, they invented a god of thunder, Jupiter or Zeus, to control the weather for them.
Exactly.
Because they couldn't forge steel with industrial scientific precision, they invented Vulcan, the god of the forge.
The imagination compensated for material weakness. Early humans were surrounded by forces they did not understand and could not control.
Storms, plagues, the changing of the seasons.
Yes. And to survive psychologically, they personified these forces. They gave them human motives and stories. That specific tension between awe-inspiring, terrifying nature and a vulnerable humanity provided the fertile soil for epic poetry and classical art.
Mythology was the legacy code created to deal with the terrifying bugs in ancient reality. They used the technology of human imagination because actual technology hadn't been invented yet.
That is a perfect translation of the concept. The epic relies on a worldview where nature is a mystery to be bargained with. But what happens when progress occurs? What happens when the OS gets a massive upgrade?
Right. What happens when the Industrial Revolution hits?
This is where the text in the Grundriss gets incredibly striking and, frankly, beautifully written. Marx asks a series of rapid-fire rhetorical questions contrasting ancient myth with modern technology.
What kind of questions?
Well, he asks, what is Vulcan compared with Roberts & Co.? Roberts & Co. being a major state-of-the-art modern manufacturing firm at the time.
So what is a mythological god of the forge compared to a real factory that can pump out 10,000 iron rails a day?
Exactly. Then he asks, what is Jupiter compared with the lightning conductor?
A lightning conductor. Oh, a lightning rod.
Yes. He continues, what is Hermes compared with the Credit Mobilier, which was a massive modern financial institution in France? Hermes was the god of trade and messengers. And finally, what becomes of the goddess Fama beside the modern printing press? Fama being the Roman goddess of rumor and fame.
Hearing those questions, I mean, this was written in 1857, but it sounds so incredibly modern. It is basically a thesis on how technology actively, literally kills magic.
It demystifies the world.
Yeah, because when you put a real copper lightning rod on the roof of your house, you no longer need the myth of Jupiter throwing thunderbolts.
No, you don't.
The lightning rod grounds the physical electricity, but it also grounds the myth. It robs the storm of its supernatural terror.
Marx is arguing that certain monumental forms of art, specifically the epic, are intrinsically tied to specific undeveloped stages of social development.
They need that lack of development to exist.
Exactly. Once real material domination over nature is established via railways, electric telegraphs, self-acting machines, factories, that specific kind of mythological imagination becomes entirely obsolete.
He writes that mythology disappears when real domination over these forces is established. Like, you cannot write a genuine, awe-inspiring epic about a storm at sea when you can track the storm on a radar and send an email to the ship telling them to steer around it.
The material conditions that made the epic possible have vanished. You cannot have an unconsciously artistic processing of nature, which is what mythology is, when your society relates to nature through hard empirical science, calculus, and heavy industry. The mystery is gone.
So does he view this as a tragedy?
What do you mean?
Well, if technology kills Jupiter, and Jupiter is the source of great art, does that mean art is just destined to wither and die in an industrial society?
No, he doesn't view it as the death of art entirely, but rather the death of a specific form of art. The art of the industrial age cannot just be a retread of ancient epics. It has to reflect its own material reality.
Right, it needs its own native apps.
Yes. The unequal development concept means we shouldn't expect art to just linearly improve as technology improves. Instead, different stages of economic development produce entirely different paradigms of art, some of which can never be repeated.
Because they are locked to their specific historical OS.
Yes. And Marx has a very poignant way of describing why we still love Greek art today. He views Greek art as the childhood of human society.
The childhood?
Yeah. He says that the historical childhood of humanity, where its most beautiful development took place, exercises an eternal charm precisely because it is a stage that will never return.
Oh, man. It's like looking at a drawing you did when you were 7 years old.
Right.
It might have this raw, unfiltered imagination and a kind of wild freedom that you, as a 30-year-old adult with a mortgage and a stressful job, can just never replicate.
Exactly.
You might be better at math now, your personal economic base is vastly stronger, you understand how the world works, but that specific artistic magic is tied irrevocably to your childhood ignorance.
That's a very apt humanizing comparison. The adult cannot become a child again, but the adult can still take pleasure in the child's naivety. And this really challenges the listener to consider our current landscape.
How so?
Well, if the telegraph and the lightning rod killed Jupiter in the 19th century, what kind of art is exclusively born from our current technological era?
Yeah, it is a fascinating question. What is our modern mythology? If we have AI, quantum computing, global instantaneous communication, genetic engineering, what is the art that can only exist now? It certainly isn't the epic poem.
It forces you to stop judging modern art by ancient standards and to recognize that every technological leap demands a completely new imaginative vocabulary. The lightning rod changed poetry just as much as it changed architecture.
Okay, so if ancient epics belong firmly in the past, in the childhood of humanity, what kind of art did these theorists actually want to see in their own time?
That's the big question.
Right. If they're looking at the gritty reality of the 19th century, what is the good art for that era? To understand their positive vision, we have to look at what they absolutely despised.
Oh, yes, we do.
And let me tell you, digging into these sources, I realized that Marx and Engels were savage, ruthless, literary critics.
They were incredibly prolific in their criticism. They didn't just read economics and history. They read contemporary poetry, novels, literary journals, and they had very strong, very public opinions.
They really did.
And by looking at what they attacked, we can actually see the core of what they demanded from aesthetics.
They did not pull their punches. Let's look at their first target. A poet named Karl Beck. This is from Engels' early writings, which you can find in volumes 2 and 6. For context, who was Karl Beck and why did Engels care about his poetry?
Karl Beck was a representative of a political and literary movement in Germany during the 1840s called True Socialism.
True socialism. It sounds like something Engels would agree with, given his politics.
You'd think so, but despite the name, Engels found them utterly detestable.
Really? Why?
The True Socialists were a group of intellectuals who tried to blend socialist ideas with a heavy dose of German philosophical idealism and romantic sentimentality.
Oh,
Instead of focusing on the harsh material realities of class struggle, industrial exploitation, and political organization, they focused on abstract, fuzzy concepts like love, brotherhood, and humanity.
so they were kind of the 19th century equivalent of people who think you can solve world poverty by holding hands and singing songs.
Yeah, is a fairly accurate parallel. And Engels takes an absolute scalpel to Karl Beck's poetry. He is disgusted by what he calls Beck's futile Weltschmerz.
Weltschmerz.
Yeah.
That is one of those great untranslatable German words. I know it literally translates to world pain or world weariness. But what does it mean in the context of poetry? Is it just being sad?
It is a specific kind of sadness. It's a deep, romantic melancholy about the state of the world. It's a passive, sentimental whining.
I see.
Engels argues that Beck's poetry is full of this impotent despair. The poetry acknowledges that the masses are suffering, it sees the poverty, but it frames this suffering in a way that is pitiful, aestheticized, and self-indulgent rather than activating or analytical.
So instead of saying, look at this injustice, let's figure out how to stop it, the poetry says, look at this injustice. Doesn't it make you want to weep at the tragedy of the human condition?
Precisely. And Engels writes that contemporary poetry should not express a feudal Weltschmerz. Instead, he argues it should express the positive fight for freedom and against tyranny, Philistinism, and religious bigotry.
Wow. Yeah.
He demands poetry that is proud, threatening, and revolutionary. He wants art that bites back. He does not want art that just sits in the corner and cries about how unfair everything is.
But why is he so hostile to sadness, though? I mean, from a psychological perspective, isn't it valid for an artist to express despair when looking at a slum or a workhouse?
From a psychological perspective, perhaps, but from a materialist, historical perspective, passive sorrow does absolutely nothing to change the economic base.
Right.
It just marinates in the symptom without ever addressing the cause. Engels is demanding an art that accurately reflects the structural tensions of its time, and in doing so, empowers people to engage with those tensions.
It's about action.
Yes. Wallowing in Weltschmerz turns the suffering of the poor into an aesthetic playground for the middle-class reader to feel bad, close the book, and go to sleep feeling morally superior because they shed a tear.
Ah, I see. It's like the difference between a sad indie acoustic song about how modern life makes you depressed versus a punk rock anthem that makes you want to smash the system causing the depression.
Exactly.
Engels is definitely asking for the punk rock anthem.
He is asking for art that has teeth, yes.
Yeah.
And we see this same demand for rigorous, unsparing engagement with reality in their critique of another true socialist, a literary historian named Karl Grun.
Okay, Karl Grun.
Grun wrote a book analyzing the great German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe.
Okay, Goethe. Even if you don't know German literature, you know the name Goethe. He wrote Faust. He wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther. He is a towering genius.
Absolutely.
But historically, he was also a very comfortable government official in the small state of Weimar, right?
Mm.
He had a very secure bourgeois life alongside his massive, world-shaking artistic achievements. He was a man full of intense contradictions.
Goethe was the embodiment of contradiction. He could write poetry that tore at the very fabric of human existence and then go to work as a minister of state enforcing petty censorship laws.
Right.
And that contradiction is exactly what a good literary critic should explore. But in volumes 4 and 6, we see Engels' critique of Karl Grun's approach. Grun is mocked mercilessly because he ignores the contradictions entirely.
So what does Grun do instead?
Grun praises Goethe's most boring, Philistine, petty bourgeois traits as the absolute ideal of human society.
We need to define those terms because they use them constantly as insults. Petty bourgeois and Philistines. What exactly do they mean when they hurl those words at someone?
Petty bourgeois refers to the lower middle class, small merchants, shopkeepers, low-level bureaucrats.
Okay.
In a cultural sense, it implies a mindset that is deeply risk-averse, obsessed with respectability, comfort, and maintaining the status quo. Philistine is a related cultural insult. It means someone who is anti-intellectual, smugly conventional, and indifferent or hostile to challenging art or radical ideas.
So to call someone a petty bourgeois Philistine is to say they are a comfortable, boring conformist who just wants to pay their taxes, mow their lawn, and never think about the massive injustices of the world.
Exactly. And Grun basically ignores the agonizing radical genius of Goethe and focuses entirely on his comfortable, rule-following, respectable side.
Nice.
Engels points out that Grun actually thinks the true human being is equal to the German petty bourgeois.
So Grun takes this complex artist who wrestled with the devil literally in the story of Faust and reduces him to a model citizen who follows all the rules. Why is that such a crime in Engels' eyes?
Well, because it is an aesthetic failure, driven by a failure to see reality. Grun is smoothing over all the rough edges. By praising the most accommodating, non-threatening aspects of Goethe's life, Grun is essentially justifying the complacent status quo of 19th century Germany.
Oh, I see.
He is using Goethe to tell his readers, see, the greatest genius in history was just a quiet, obedient citizen. You should be one too.
It neuters the art. It turns a wild animal into a house cat.
Perfectly said.
And this smoothing over, this retreat from the harshness of reality is something Marx tracks culturally in other ways, too. Like in Volume 6, Marx makes a fascinating observation about the return of what he calls Grobian literature.
Ah, yes. Grobian literature is a very specific reference. It refers to a style of writing that originated in the 16th century, around the time of the Reformation.
Right.
The word Grobian essentially means boorish, rude, or coarse.
Marx notes that in his own time, in the mid-19th century, this style is making a comeback, but he doesn't view it as a genuine expression of working-class anger.
No, not at all.
He describes it as flat, bombastic, bragging, and hysterically sensitive. He uses a great word, thrasonical, which means boastful.
He is describing writing that puts on a great show of rude vigor in its attack. It brandishes a sword with an enormous waste of energy, shouting and cursing, only to let the sword fall completely flat.
He calls it clothing a Philistine message in a plebeian form.
Yes, and plebeian here means associating with the common people or the lower classes. So what Marx is identifying is a psychological profile of a certain type of writer.
Okay, what's the profile?
This writer adopts the aesthetics of the angry mob, the rude language, the boastful threats, the coarse insults, but they're using it to deliver a totally safe Philistine message.
It is performative anger. It
Yeah.
appeals to petty, immediate squabbles in the face of grand historical struggles.
Yes, exactly.
It's all style and noise with no theoretical substance or real engagement with the material world. It's a writer cosplaying as a revolutionary without actually risking anything.
Precisely. And this is where we have to synthesize these critiques.
Right, because I have to ask on behalf of the listener, are Marx and Engels just acting like grumpy literary snobs here?
It's a fair question.
Think about it. Oh, Beck's poetry is too sad. Oh, Grun's critique is too boring. Oh, this Grobian writing is too loud and rude. Are they just impossible to please? Is it just aesthetic snobbery?
It is a vital question, and it's so easy to read them that way. But if we look closely at the underlying thread, we see it isn't snobbery at all. It's a profound theoretical demand based on their materialist worldview.
Okay, how so?
They are rejecting art that functions as an escape hatch.
An escape hatch from what? The OS.
An escape hatch from the material conditions and contradictions of reality. Let's look at the three examples. Beck's Weltschmerz is an escape into self-pity.
Right, you don't have to fight if you're weeping.
Exactly. You don't have to fight the system if you are too busy weeping over it. Grun's analysis of Goethe is an escape into comfortable middle-class morality. You don't have to face the contradictions of society if you pretend the highest ideal is just being a quiet bureaucrat.
And the Grobian literature.
It is an escape into empty, noisy bravado. You don't have to do the hard work of theoretical analysis if you can just shout insults and sound tough.
Wow. In every single case, the artist or the critic is refusing to look the actual historical tensions of their society in the eye. They are hiding.
They demand that art accurately reflect and actively engage with the material tensions of its time. If society is being ripped apart by class struggle, rapid industrialization, and political upheaval, art shouldn't pretend everything is fine.
No.
Nor should it just weep helplessly, nor should it just scream incoherently. It should capture that dynamic tension and clarify it. They want art that is a magnifying glass, or perhaps a weapon, but never a cozy blanket.
This is a heavy responsibility to place on art.
Yeah.
And it begs the question, if you do retreat from reality, if you hide in your feelings or your noisy bragging or your safe respectability,
Right.
where do you ultimately end up?
That's the scary part.
Right. This leads us directly to our final area of exploration, because that retreat from reality leads straight to a kind of cultural narcissism.
A narcissism that ultimately turns all of culture, and even history itself, into a commodity to be bought and sold on the market.
To illustrate this, we have one of the most blistering, incredibly detailed, and honestly hilarious takedowns in the entire MECW. In Volume 11, Marx and Engels target a writer named Gottfried Kinkel.
We need some historical context on Kinkel.
Right.
He was a poet, a professor, and he participated in the failed European revolutions of 1848.
Okay, so he had some street cred.
He did. He was imprisoned, made a dramatic escape, and became a political refugee in London. In London, he became, frankly, a bit of a celebrity exile. He loved the spotlight, he went on speaking tours, and he cultivated a very dramatic, romantic persona.
Marx and Engels dedicate a significant amount of text to analyzing Kinkel's personality and his writing, painting him as the ultimate petty bourgeois narcissist. And the defining anecdote, the moment that perfectly captures their critique, happens at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851.
The Great Exhibition was a massive world-changing event. They built the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, this marvel of modern glass and iron architecture. And they filled it with the greatest technological and industrial achievements from around the globe.
Like locomotives, enormous steam engines, telegraphs.
Yes, looms, all of it. It was the ultimate showcase of the economic base, flexing its muscles on a global scale.
It is the absolute pinnacle of 19th century material reality. And Kinkel, the Romantic poet, goes to visit it. He writes an article about his visit to the Great Exhibition. Out of all the world-changing technology, out of all the marvels of industry that are actively reshaping human civilization, what does Kinkel admire the most? What does he write about?
A giant mirror.
A giant mirror exhibited in the Crystal Palace.
Yes. Marx and Engels absolutely pounce on this detail. It is too perfect a metaphor for them to ignore.
I can imagine.
They write, "For him, the objective world reduces itself to a mirror, the subjective world to a cliché. Under the pretext of seeing the beautiful side of everything, he dallies with everything, and this dallying he calls poetry, self-sacrifice, or religion as the occasion demands."
It is a devastating surgical critique of narcissism. The objective world, the massive, churning, terrifying reality of the Industrial Revolution right in front of his face, is completely ignored. He can only engage the world if it reflects his own image back to him.
It represents the ultimate intellectual retreat. When the material world is too complex, too threatening, or too demanding, the petty bourgeois artist shrinks it down until it is just a backdrop for their own ego.
Wait, hearing you describe Kinkel staring into this mirror instead of looking at the Great Exhibition?
Yeah.
That sounds exactly like someone taking a selfie at the Grand Canyon. Is he basically describing a 19th century influencer?
Yeah. The psychological parallel is undeniably strong.
I mean, we live in an era where turning the objective world into a mirror to reflect oneself is the dominant mode of media. You go to a breathtaking national park or a profound historical monument or even a protest, and what is the primary impulse for so many people?
To take a photo of themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
To turn their back to the objective reality, hold up a phone, and take a picture of themselves with the reality as a blurry, aestheticized background. The objective world is reduced to a mirror. We commodify our own lives, our own histories for public consumption, just like Kinkel did on his speaking tours.
That is a stunning parallel to draw, and I want to highlight the specific word they use in the translation, dallying. To dally is to interact superficially, playfully, without commitment or deep, rigorous engagement.
Right.
When culture becomes entirely self-referential, when it's just a mirror for the artist's ego, it loses its ability to critique the material world. It just dallies. It plays with aesthetics while the real world burns.
And this superficial dallying spreads. It infects everything. It's not just Kinkel and his mirror. In Volume 10, they critique a philosopher named Georg Friedrich Dahmer. Dahmer wrote a book lamenting the decay of culture. He was crying about the loss of the good old days, how everything beautiful was being destroyed by modernity.
But Marx and Engels point out that Dahmer isn't mourning the loss of real culture. He isn't mourning the grand sweep of human achievement.
What is he mourning?
He is mourning the decay of the specific small-town, petty bourgeois culture of places like Nuremberg in Germany, a culture that, in their blistering words, can produce nothing greater than a collection of Sancho Panza maxims and rules of wisdom.
Sancho Panza, the sidekick from Don Quixote, who is famous for his folksy, simplistic, often cowardly proverbs.
Exactly. Dahmer is mistaking the death of his specific, cozy, unchallenging worldview for the death of all human culture. He thinks that because the comfortable world of the small shopkeeper is being destroyed by industrialization, that beauty itself is dying.
He is projecting his own petty bourgeois anxieties onto the entire universe.
And this is the ultimate danger of the Philistine worldview. When you reduce the world to a mirror for your own ego, and you reduce culture to a collection of comfortable, folksy maxims, you pave the way for the total commodification of reality.
Because if truth is just whatever makes you feel comfortable, then truth is just a product. Which brings us to a stark, chilling observation from Volume 21. They are discussing how the bourgeoisie, the ruling capitalist class, interacts with culture.
This is a crucial point.
They write that the bourgeoisie turns everything into a commodity, hence also the writing of history.
This is the logical conclusion of the retreat from reality. If there is no objective truth to be wrestled with, if everything is just subjective feeling, Weltschmerz, and aesthetic dallying, then history itself loses its anchor. It just becomes another product on the shelf.
They write, it is in its nature, a condition of its existence, to falsify all commodities.
Yeah.
It falsified history. And the version of history which is most highly paid is that which is best falsified for the purposes of the bourgeoisie.
They specifically call out the English historian Thomas Macaulay as the unattainable model of this kind of highly paid falsification.
What did Macaulay do?
Macaulay wrote histories that perfectly justified the rise of the English middle class, making it seem like the glorious, inevitable peak of human civilization, while smoothing over the violence and exploitation that built it.
He was writing Grun's biography of Goethe, but applying it to the entire history of England.
Precisely. If we connect this back to the very beginning of our conversation, it's a warning about the stakes of art. If art and literature retreat from the harsh realities of the economic base, if they hide in sadness or noisy bragging or narcissistic mirrors, they don't just become bad, boring art.
Right.
They become tools of the very system they refuse to critique. They become commodities that falsify history to keep the factories running without interruption. The artist who thinks they are independent from the economy ends up becoming its most useful employee.
Wow. If you are listening to this on your commute or while washing dishes, you might be wondering why a feud with a forgotten German poet named Karl or a guy staring at a mirror in 1851 matters to you.
It might seem distant, sure.
But it matters because what we have just unpacked is an incredibly sharp, demanding toolkit for consuming modern media.
It is a framework that asks you to look past the surface level of the art you consume.
The next time you read a novel, watch a blockbuster film, or scroll endlessly through a social media feed, you can use these exact questions. Ask yourself, is this piece of media actually engaging with the real material conditions of our world? Or is it just feudal Weltschmerz, wallowing in sadness and making you feel helpless without pointing to the structural cause?
Exactly. Is it challenging the system or comforting you?
Is it wrestling with the harsh, complex reality of the economic operating system we are all running on? Or is it just a giant mirror reflecting your own face back to you while history is sold to the highest bidder?
It challenges you to demand more from your culture, to look past the cozy Sancho Panza maxims that make you feel safe, and demand art that is fiercely aware of its own material foundation.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the cultural side of the MECW, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to ponder on your own. We spent a lot of time talking about the Grundriss and how Marx suggested ancient Greek art achieved this monumental, unrepeatable status because it was the childhood of human development.
Yes, an era of unchecked mythological imagination compensating for a lack of real control over nature.
A historical childhood that, no matter how much we admire it, can never return because the material conditions have permanently changed.
We can't go backwards.
So, what does the art of our current hyper-industrial, hyper-commodified era represent? If the Greeks were the childhood of humanity, where are we now?
That is the big question.
Are we in the cynical, exhausted old age of human culture, endlessly remaking the same superhero movies, falsifying history, and staring blankly into our digital mirrors? Or is there a dialectical flip side? Are we just accumulating a massive new pile of Engels' historical rubbish, new legacy code, new myths born of algorithms, global networks, and AI, out of which a completely unprecedented, unimaginable form of art is about to be born?
That is the ultimate aesthetic question of our time. What happens when the new OS finally gets its native app?
When you look back at that massive 19th century factory in your mind's eye, at the gears and the smoke, remember, the spreadsheet in the counting house doesn't tell the whole story. But neither does the song hummed on the assembly line. The truth, the real engine of human history, is the relentless friction between the two. Keep exploring that friction.